She was built as a clipper ship in 1869. The CUTTY SARK was built in Dumbarton, Scotland, and she got her name from the poem called Tam O'Shanter, written by Robert Burns. The poem is about Tam, who is a farmer, and he encounters a coven of witches. One of these witches is very beautiful, and she is wearing an outfit that is very revealing. A short dress or short shirt is referred to as a CUTTY SARK by the Scottish. Being overwhelmed by her beauty, Tam cries out, "We all done CUTTY SARK." At this point, the witches see him and they start to chase him. He gets on his horse and flees and narrowly escapes. But in doing so, the beautiful witch wearing the CUTTY SARK actually grabs onto his horse's tail. And that is why the figurehead on the CUTTY SARK ship is the beautiful nanny who is holding a horse's tail. The CUTTY SARK was launched in 1870, and she was built for the tea route, which would run from Shanghai to London. Speed was of the essence, and it was encouraged to be the fastest ship to get the load back to London. First ship in receiving or unloading the cargo would actually get a bonus. The CUTTY SARK would have 32,000 square feet of sail, making her very fast. The clipper ship would introduce speed to the cargo shipping trade. Clippers could travel up to 4 times faster than regular cargo ships. They were built much sleeker with a long and narrow keel that would glide through the water and a sleek and smooth hull. This would allow the ship to just cut through the water with minimal of resistance. But one of the major problems that would face the cargo ships would be barnacles that would cling to the hull. In fact, according to Aaron Hewitt, who is the current general manager for the CUTTY SARK, says that with just 10% of the hull covered with barnacles, the ship would have to increase power as much as 50% just to compensate. Hewitt would go on to say that CUTTY SARK's copper-lined keel and hull would be an advantage. It contains 60% copper, 40% zinc, and a trace of iron. The copper would actually be a deterrent to the sea crustaceans that were normally attracted to the hull. The CUTTY SARK's first 2 years of service would have her compete with her competition. One notable ship was named the Thermopylae. The Thermopylae was also a clipper ship, which competed in the tea route, and it would be the Thermopylae that would have the better speed record at the time. 2 years into her service, the CUTTY SARK would leave Shanghai the same time the Thermopylae did. In a close race, the CUTTY SARK would take the lead. However, when she approached the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa just before heading into the South Atlantic Ocean, she would lose her rudder. The captain knew that pulling into port for repairs meant losing to the Thermopylae and losing the bonus. So he ordered his crew and ship's carpenter Henry Henderson to actually build and fit a new rudder while still at sea. The crew would find need for a blacksmith, but none would be available aboard ship. But as legend has it, there was a stowaway on board who grew up in a smithy and actually showed the crew how to make a forge on the deck of the ship. They needed much more room than what the carpenter's workshop offered, and being at sea, this would cause many problems for the workers on the deck. The rough seas and waves crashing over the side of the ship caused worker conditions to be difficult, to say the least. It certainly would not be the safest working environment for the men, and despite all the adversity needed, the crew would actually forge and fit a new rudder while at sea. As a reward, the ship's carpenter Henry Henderson received a 50-pound bonus. The British Board of Trade would be so impressed that they would make his technique the official way to replace a rudder while at sea. The CUTTY SARK would arrive in London 7 days after the Thermopylae and lose. However, due to her heroic new techniques, she would become famous. When it comes to CUTTY SARK's crew, generally the crew would work 4 hours on and 4 hours off in shifts. The only exception would be when all hands on deck would be called. It had been said that an apprentice had once fallen asleep and had a nest of baby rats dropped on his face as punishment. Another punishment for sleeping on their watch would result in riding the gray mare, which meant that the crew member was hoisted high up into the rigging to endure the wind and elements to wake them up, to prevent them from sleeping on their watch. The Cutty Sark could carry a load of cargo valued up to 270,000 pounds, which is approximately 18 million pounds in today's currency. As tea began to grow in popularity, it would become the #1 drink in Britain, and demand for this product grew. Bringing it from Shanghai to London became a priority. In her first few years on the tea trade route, the Cutty Sark would deliver a total of 4,500 tons of tea. But despite her speed, the Cutty Sark would soon be facing the changing technological advances of her time. The introduction of the steamship would challenge her. The steamship did not have to rely on the wind for movement. In 1870, the Cutty Sark was part of a 50-ship fleet in the trade. But as of 1877, she would be part of a fleet of clippers numbering only 9. The rest of the ships had actually been converted to steamships. In 1869, the Suez Canal would open, which would allow the steamships to access a quicker route to London. The canal allowed ships to travel across the top of Africa's coastline, heading into the northern Atlantic Ocean, instead of having to travel down below the southern tip of Africa on the southern coast. This shortcut would actually shave over 3,000 miles off the trip, but the clipper ships did not have the power to use this route. So despite their quickness, they had to continue to use the original route. This would result in the clipper ships arriving in London up to 12 days after the steamer ships had already unloaded their cargo. And this was the beginning of the end for the clipper ships in the tea trade route. Lack of demand for her services would force the Cutty Sark being reduced to tramping. This meant that she would travel from port to port looking for cargo to carry for potential customers. Carrying cargo like paraffin, oil, and coal took their toll on the ship. During the time, a gold rush in Australia would make finding well-trained and reliable crew members very difficult. In fact, upon entering port in Sydney, many crew members would desert the ship in search of their gold fortunes. In 1880, the Cutty Sark would head for Australia under the command of James Wallace. Wallace had only 2 years of experience as a captain. His first mate would be Sidney Smith, and Smith had a reputation of being a bit of a tyrant. This was a dark time in the ship's history. She was about to embark on what is referred to as the hellship voyage. On August 10, 1880, on the way to Japan, the Cutty Sark would be caught in a very terrible storm. It was a bad storm and all hands on deck were called. In a fit of rage, first mate Sidney Smith would actually strike able seaman John Francis in the head with a capstan bar and kill him. This happened on August 11, 1880. It was said that John Francis was not actually trained to be an able seaman, and his confusion on procedure caused Sidney Smith to lose his temper. He would actually be aided by Captain James Wallace in escaping to an American ship to avoid prosecution. The captain, knowing his career could be ruined as well as his reputation for doing this, Captain Wallace also feared prosecution for aiding a murderer to escape. At 4 a.m. on September 9, 1880, the helmsman on duty reported seeing Captain James Wallace pacing the decks back and forth. He then heard a splash. Upon investigation, the only signs of life in the open ocean were the circling sharks. Captain James Wallace was never seen again. After Cutty Sark lost her captain to suicide, her next captain would be William Bruce. Bruce was a major alcoholic and was very reckless. In fact, a drunken stupor with his first mate almost resulted in the Cutty Sark colliding with another ship. Eventually, Captain Bruce would be relieved of his duties as captain. The Cutty Sark began carrying cargo of raw wool from Australia, and the wool would be packed in bundles, and the crew would use a jack screw on the wood separating the bales to fit as many bales as possible into the cargo holds of the ship. This technique would allow Cutty Sark to carry as much as 4,000 bales of wool per trip. As wool's popularity grew, the Cutty Sark would carry wool from Australia to London, with rewards of up to 12 million pounds in today's currency per trip. This demand meant that the new era for the Cutty Sark and her days of tamping were over. It would be Richard Woodgett replacing William Bruce as Cutty Sark's captain. Woodgett had a much better reputation and was more respected than the last two captains of the ship. The speed of Cutty Sark on the route from Australia to London would continue to impress. The sudden winds allowed the ship to travel as much as 300 miles per day, and she would turn in a wool clipper and be reborn. One of the problems Cutty Sark faced on a new route would be the traveling in the Antarctic Ocean. Icebergs were a constant danger to the ship. A line of crewmen would relay messages from the bow all the way back to the ship's wheel to inform the helmsman on direction. In a time where there were no radio or intership intercom systems, this was the fastest, most efficient way of communication. In one of Captain Woodgett's logs, he would describe an iceberg in 1893 as being well over 1,000 feet high. He would also describe the sounds coming from them, sounding like firing rifles and cannons, sounds that we used as descriptions. Captain Richard Woodgett would serve as Cutty Sark's captain for 11 years. He liked to take photographs as well, so he took many of the photograph of the crew and people aboard ship. By 1895, the routes were mostly run by steamships, and after many years of lack of use, the Cutty Sark was sold to the Portuguese, and she would be renamed the Feria. She would sail under the Portuguese flag for nearly 27 years, but in 1922 she would return home. The ship would be purchased by a retired sea captain, and she would be docked in Falmouth Harbor and used as a training ship for Navy cadets. In 1923, while Prohibition stopped the consumption of alcohol in the United States, the ship would be made even more famous by a spirits company naming their Scotch blended whiskey Cutty Sark. The label had an illustration of the ship on a bottle. It would be sailors named rum runners that would smuggle alcohol into the United States by the Florida Keys. The Scotch is still being produced today, and as of May 6, 2023, and the company can thank the Cutty Sark vessel herself for most of its success. By the end of World War II, the Cutty Sark was no longer used as a training vessel. She would escape the fate of the HMS Implacable, and in Greenwich was given a permanent location as a historical museum. She was fully restored and opened to the public in 1954. On May 21, 2007, a horrible sight indeed would occur. The Cutty Sark would catch on fire. But fortunately for her, the planking, deck houses, captain's quarters, and 95% of the timber structures were removed for restoration, and they were stored in separate locations. This meant that what was in the fire was mostly new deck planks and her metal frame. It was actually determined that a dust extractor left running overheated and started the fire. The ship would be fully restored with only about 5% of the original timber being lost. Cutty Sark's ironworks frames would be treated with special decay-preventing paint. The props and shores would be replaced, supporting the hull evenly, and the keel, main deck, and sheathing would also be replaced. The ship would be enclosed in a glass building at the waterline, so visitors could also see the keel and the bottom of the ship. This also would keep the contact of the ship away from the corrosive seawater. The Cutty Sark is open to the public now as of May 6, 2023. She is part of the Royal Museums in Greenwich. I'll put the website in the description below if you want to check out the link. Looking to support the historic and beautiful ship, I purchased a model of the Cutty Sark from her gift shop. In all, there were 3 sizes: mini, small, and medium. The medium size was sold out, so I purchased the small size. The model is described as being 9.5 inches long. The total, including shipping, for me was $32.88. I look forward to receiving it, and I will most certainly share it with you in a video when I do receive it. And it has to come a long way. It's got to come across the pond to me here in New England in the United States. So my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video on the Cutty Sark, this wonderful ship, and I'll be doing a presentation of the ship model from the gift shop as soon as I get it.